Welcome to the next in the series of webinars looking at the central U.S. drought status. This webinar is being put together through the efforts of the National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration, U.S. Department of Agriculture, the regional climate centers, the state climatologists, and several other partnering groups. The webinar is intended to provide a status update and present what we see as the most likely directions in terms of weather and climate moving forward. My name is Stuart Foster. I'm the state climatologist of Kentucky, and I'm coming to you from the Kentucky Climate Center at Western Kentucky University in Bowling Green, Kentucky. You see some general information there in terms of folks that have collaborated on this, along with the date of our next webinar, which is scheduled for November 15th, and that should be 1 p.m. Central Standard Time, I guess, once we get into November. A note that you can access previous webinars, and we'll be able to access this one within a couple days on the following links there at the Midwestern Regional Climate Center and the High Plains Regional Climate Center. The agenda for this talk, we're going to take a look at current conditions in terms of the drought as it exists over the central region. We'll provide a little climatological perspective in terms of how it's gotten to be that way, how it ranks in terms of a historical viewpoint, and so forth. Talk a little bit about some impacts that have developed and some concerns about impacts moving forward. And then we'll include a climatological outlook that gives you the best indication that we have right now as to what you can expect in terms of temperature precipitation patterns moving forward. Some of the key points that we're going to talk about and highlight in the coming slides. First of all, we look at current conditions. We've seen some improvement. Really, this is an ongoing pattern that's been in place now for a month or two, improving conditions in eastern areas. Dryness in Great Plains impacting agriculture, entering the fire season is very important, and seeing some issues with water supplies developing. In terms of the evolution of the drought and its impacts, again, we saw the drought develop in an early core area in the Mississippi Valley, the lower Ohio River Valley, centered in western Kentucky, and it has spread to the west and to the north into the Great Plains, and then northern Great Plains, an area of particular concern at this point. The outlook, we're going to talk about the prospects for El Nino. They have diminished, and this is a change from our past webinar. Drought conditions and patterns are likely to persist. We're in such a serious situation that it's going to take a while to get out of that. And looking into 2013, key thing to point out is that with the drought at this stage, and if it continues to intensify, then we're going to have some concerns that go well beyond agriculture. We'll start out. You see an image of the drought monitor, current drought monitor, released on the 18th here, and the core area again in the central plains, largely extending from Kansas through Nebraska into South Dakota, and really note a very large portion of the country that's affected. This next slide focuses in on the central region. And you can see the percentage of areas that are in different categories of drought. Key thing to note there when you look at the current status and compare it to last week, very little change over the last week. We've seen the drought intensify over a period of 3 months ago, certainly going back to July. A couple maps showing perspectives on current soil moisture conditions. In terms of the overall anomaly deficit of soil moisture in millimeters in the left-hand map, and really showing kind of bullseye area developed over parts of Iowa, Minnesota, Wisconsin in particular. And then on the lower right gives you some more historical perspective by providing percentiles going back. So you can see several areas there, a large portion that is in the 5% or down to 2% or less. Historically that we've seen soil conditions at this level. And here's another perspective, not based on a model view, but based on reports from the field that shows that the situation is certainly very serious, particularly in the upper plains. and moving toward the west. Again, a bit more relief we've seen in the lower Midwest, the eastern portion of the area that had been affected earlier on. Here's a couple maps showing precipitation anomalies, and you've seen this information before, but we're going to go back here a little bit just to understand the evolution of this drought. If we look through the period beginning of March through June, you'll recall that it was a very warm spring. We saw record temperatures over the spring-summer period over a large region. And the earliest core area for the drought, again, was centered along the Mississippi Valley and the lower Ohio Valley, far western Kentucky into southwestern Indiana, parts of Illinois, Missouri. And then that pattern really persisted through June. We got to late June, and things really intensified. June was a very dry month, and then we had the extreme heat that came late in the month and carried over into early July. But then as we got into July, we saw a shifting of the pattern of precipitation, and we saw relief through parts of the Appalachian region and the lower Ohio Valley. Some of that area that had been hit the hardest early on started to see some improvement, and the area of most intense dryness and drought development pushed to the west and a little bit north toward the plain states, and that shows up very clearly there. That lack of precipitation, again with the previous soil moisture slides, hints at the problems in the upper plains as we look into the winter wheat planting season. You're familiar, I believe, with the Palmer Drought Severity Index. Has been used for quite a long time, recently supplemented, and the Drought Monitor has become the tool of preference. But we have Palmer Drought Severity data going back a long period of time. This is showing the conditions in July and then again in September. Again, the July picture shows still a core area in the lower Midwest, Mississippi Valley region. And as you get into September, that shift farther west and farther north. Earlier during the summer, there was a lot of conversation about how this drought was comparing to previous droughts that we've had. So I went ahead and put in a couple slides here. 1988, a very intense drought that had significant impacts in terms of agriculture, water supplies, so forth. And you can see that drought had a northern bias to it. Certainly affected parts of the lower Midwest and even into Appalachian region, southeast, but the upper tier of the Great Plains states, very evident there. And then if we look back a little bit farther, we heard reference back to the 1950s, and here's a 1954 drought. Again, a large region of the country, but again, this case a little bit more of a southern bias, not affecting the upper plains. So key point here is that the drought that we're seeing this year is certainly historically significant. There's no question about that. But every drought has its own signature, so it's hard to say that one's exactly like another. They all develop uniquely. To give you a little sense, going back to some early impacts and to provide a little bit more historical perspective, being from Kentucky, I've certainly been focusing on issues here in this state. Going back to the Paducah area in far western Kentucky, we put together a time series of daily precipitation data going back well over 100 years, and we tracked a cumulative 120-day precipitation total and found that when we look at 120-day precipitation totals in the month of July, that 2012 was the driest such period on record, 2.94 inches total in that area over a 120-day period, breaking the previous record going back to 1910. Again, more evidence of just how severe conditions have been, and this is in a core part of the drought. Some of the implications of that here in Kentucky, and some of these may be seen in other areas. Of course, we started the year with a high market prices for grain. That led to more acreage being planted in corn in Kentucky. And then we got into the early growing season with record precipitation deficits. We got into late June and had extreme heat. And so the impacts on corn, you can see some evidence there in the photograph, very extreme. Having said that, a few areas in far western Kentucky that are irrigated, and then more areas across the Mississippi into the Boot Heel area of Missouri, areas that are irrigated. Early estimates were hinting at farms producing yields of 200 plus bushels an acre of corn. Meanwhile, areas that were not irrigated in drought, some estimates that we've gotten have been less than 10 bushels an acre, and yields have been very, very poor across the board. Raises issues for farmers looking at whether irrigation is something that they need to consider in areas where they haven't investigated it or invested in it in the past. And in Kentucky and some other parts of the country, some of this farmland is also underlain by karst terrain. So we've got these underground cave systems. Creates a lot of uncertainty about the availability and reliability of groundwater resources. So that's something that's come up here in Kentucky this year that we've really been focusing on. Elsewhere, we take a look again at a nationwide perspective. We've got a few slides here looking at, first of all, hay production and highlighting the areas, the major growing areas for hay, and then the areas where drought is evident across the country. And you can see that much of the prime location for hay production is experiencing drought in a very significant way. Next slide shows a time series track going back to June of the percentage of the hay areas that are located in drought by level of intensity. The key thing here is that the pattern that emerged into July has been pretty stable since then. And you see the same thing when we look at cattle producing areas very quickly. And in terms of the persistence of that, again, not much change over the last several months. So a persistent pattern of drought as it has shifted a little bit farther west and north. And then now looking at winter wheat areas experiencing drought, primarily through the plains, but some winter wheat in the lower Midwest Mississippi Valley. And I mention that because when you look at the next slide, you'll see that there's been some level of improvement in terms of the amount of winter wheat area in drought. That's because of, I think, improvements in some of those eastern margins. But certainly if you look in the plains and the area that is really the heartland for winter wheat production, drought is very evident and intensifying, if anything, in that region. So agricultural concerns, again, winter wheat planting and emergence is the concern right now as we look at the upper Great Plains. Precipitation that was needed during September to provide the necessary soil moisture for the winter wheat that's planted to emerge simply wasn't there because of the persistent dry patterns. And in some areas, North Dakota, farmers are not able to get crop insurance until the spring on winter wheat crops. So creates a significant risk management decision for farmers, and many farmers have chosen not to plant at all. Some have gone ahead and taken that chance, hoping that soil moisture, that precipitation arrives and provides the needed soil moisture. Also, currently conditions are very poor, again, in terms of pasture, the availability of stock water for livestock. As we look forward, then, there's a critical need for groundwater recharge within the next month or so until we get to when soils freeze. At that point, whatever precipitation moisture that might come is not going to be available for recharge. And again, a need for runoff to help to refill ponds, reservoirs that are used for farm operations. Now we move from the agricultural sector into looking at the Mississippi River system. Here we're looking at impacts by sector and navigation, municipal, and industrial, and energy. We've read a lot this summer about the impacts of the low water levels on the barge traffic and requirement to have to dredge the river, so forth. Mississippi River is looking at the likelihood of record low flow conditions below St. Louis, particularly once the augmentation from the Missouri River system cuts back. So navigation is something we're certainly well aware of. There have been issues arising with municipal water supplies. So communities that get their water out of the river or its tributaries or reservoirs, there are concerns there. Probably ease up a little bit as we get into the winter months, but quite a concern there. And again, in some cases, some important industrial users that need access to water that's where supplies are threatened. A key area that's already being seen and could become an issue next year is in the energy sector. So there are a number of power plants, coal-fired nuclear plants in the Mississippi River system where they've got to have sufficient water for cooling operations in order for them to be able to operate. So the outlook looking into the fall and winter is that navigation is probably not going to be affected much more than it has been up to this point, not expecting a lot of change. Again, municipal water issues and energy, probably not major issues over the next few months, but if the drought continues well into next spring and into summer and we get into the heat of the summer, could be some very serious concerns develop at that point. Here's a map that looks at 14-day average stream flow, areas that are below normal in a historically significant sense. This is information from the U.S. Geological Survey. Key thing here is that we've got tributaries that come into the Mississippi system and streams that flow into the Great Lakes that are at historically low levels. Along with that, then, here's a slide showing levels in the Great Lakes, and along with forecasts into the over the next 12 months or so that show, first of all, that levels have been below, and secondly, that they're likely to continue to be below for most cases. And this, again, has created problems for shipping on the lake system. So both in terms of the channels, having to dredge channels and dredge harbors, it means that the vessels, the barges, cannot be loaded as fully, and that creates inefficiencies and increases costs. Now, if the drought persists, the vulnerabilities can spread to many other sectors. And again, we've already highlighted some of these, but these are some areas that are likely to become more important next year once we get into spring and summer if we don't see the relief that we're hoping for. Again, continuing agricultural impacts, key thing is that the soil moisture that was available this year is not being replenished right now, could create significant problems next year. Continued heightened fire conditions as dry situation persists. Ecosystem damage, water supply issues, we've talked about those a little bit. The energy sector, we've talked about those issues. They can become much more significant next year. Infrastructure, we're looking at buildings. So if soil dries out, particular areas where there's a good bit of clay, and that clay is sensitive to the soil moisture. If the soils dry out, there can be cracking of foundations. Likewise, underground water lines and so forth can shift and crack, create leaks. So the concerns about infrastructure, we've talked about issues in navigation, and then more broadly in terms of impacts on recreation and tourism. So the drought impacts could spread much more widely than what we're really focused on at this point. Now take a look at the climate outlook. We'll look at a couple weeks out, take a look at the month of November, and then November through January, along with an overall drought outlook. Here's the 8 to 14-day outlook. Has some positive aspects in it because it's calling for an enhanced likelihood of above normal precipitation across the upper plains. So some troughing development, stronger jet flow there, creates an environment that makes it possible for precipitation to be above normal. So we're hoping that plays out in that area. Looking at the monthly outlook for November, you can see on the left a fairly large area in the central part of the country, a little westward bias, where we're expecting above normal temperatures. On the right-hand side, we still see persistence of an area where we have an enhanced likelihood, slightly enhanced likelihood of below normal precipitation. Important to point out that pattern there is there for a little different reason than before. During the summer, that involved the land-atmosphere interactions there, the lack of soil moisture, taking away a source of moisture that would feed convection and thunderstorms. So we don't have that there, but still models are suggesting a persistence of a dry area in that part of the country. It's worth pointing out, though, that the strongest signals, both on the monthly outlook and looking ahead on the 3-month outlook, are in the North Alaska region as opposed to the lower 48. One thing that's changed from the last webinar, at that point there was concern about the development of an El Nino, a weak to moderate El Nino, and there's some likelihood of that. That's kind of come out of the outlook at this point. So the models are suggesting that El Nino is not likely to develop, and so that's going to affect our outlook moving forward. So the 3-month outlook, again, then really does not have a signal of El Nino in there. You see the locations, again, of above normal temperatures likely over the western half, and then some pockets of below normal precipitation possible across the eastern half of the plains, upper Midwest area. But again, those patterns are not real strong signals at this point. To some extent, we have some time to play with here as we get into the winter months and hope that things improve. On the other hand, in the upper plains and such, it's critical to get the soil moisture recharged while we can here before the soils freeze. Drought outlook then, pretty much more of the same. The level of the drought is such that would require some significant precipitation inputs to make a dent in it and across much of the Great Plains area. But we have seen improvement and expect to continue to see some improvement in the eastern portion, while drought may start to develop further northward and westward. So again, to summarize, some improvement in the east. We're happy to see that. Dryness in Great Plains is impacting agriculture, fire, water supply issues. In terms of the evolution of the drought and its impacts, there's been some recovery in lower Midwest and a shift of expanding dryness west and north. Outlook, prospects of El Nino have diminished. Drought conditions and patterns are likely to persist, however. It's going to take a while to work our way through those. And looking into 2013, if we don't see a recovery, we expect impacts to spread well beyond agriculture, and we're quite concerned about that. So if you want more information, here's some links where you can go to find that information. And certainly do appreciate everyone's time and attention. We thank you for coming and participating in today's webinar. But very interested in your feedback. Let us know if this is a product that's valuable for you, and if there's something that we can do to make it more so.